There we go. It was a dark and stormy night. We are talking about Jesus walking on water today. We are in 7 different signs. Anybody a big novel reader here? Anybody like to read novels? Awesome. I do not. And so I'm just going to go off of this and hope that you guys have heard this. It was a dark and stormy night. Have we heard this opening line before? It was a dark and stormy night. From the 1830 novel, Paul Clifford, it became known as a trite kind of, it's like something kind of cheesy that you probably start a book with, an opening line. There's a whole bunch of good opening lines in books. And what an opening line does is set the scene. So I feel like this is a great opening line to set the scene for what we have today. We have a little comic here about Snoopy. We remember Snoopy, that he liked to write a book. He was always trying to work on his book and his opening line. And he starts off, it was a dark and stormy night. Then Lucy, of course. So Lucy has an opinion on everything. She says, that's a terrible way to begin a story. It's so trite. Once upon a time, that's the way all good stories begin. Do that, begin your story with once upon a time. Snoopy thinks. Once upon a time, it was a dark and stormy night. Snoopy and everyone is trying to set the scene. We have a scene here that is absolutely mind-blowing. Well, we just actually saw a scene that was absolutely mind-blowing. And I think to myself, when I'm looking at these, there's such amazing things happening in this book. And we know that John has these 7 signs. And as we're going to learn a little bit today, nothing is misplaced in this book. I would like to talk to John one day, ask him how long it took him to write this gospel. My guess wouldn't be it was like a beginning to end, quickly just kind of jot it all down. I'm sure it took him 10, 15, 20 years to get everything in the place that he wanted. So we go from one trite kind of cheesy thing to the next. And this is like my childhood, the idea of to be continued. Anybody ever watch, well, this is Looney Tunes, and we know we've all watched a bit of Looney Tunes in our lives. But I was thinking about TGIF, thank goodness it's Friday, those sitcoms that we watched in the evenings on Friday nights. You know, we had 3 channels in my house, didn't have cable, and so I memorized every single slot of TV that everything was going on all the time. I knew when Family Matters was coming on, when Full House was already on, when everything else was coming on. And the best and worst episodes were the to be continued. I would always be looking at the clock and be like, how are they going to resolve this story? How are they going to do that within the next 4 minutes? It's absolutely impossible. But of course, to be continued comes on the screen. I feel like this miracle is a to be continued. We take last week when Nick was here, he was talking about the feeding of the 5,000. And this here is the Jesus walking on water. 2 very big and significant miracles. 2 very big things that we often separate. We often put 2 different sides. But I kind of want us to look at these and say, hey, they might be a bit more connected than we think. So we see last week, Jesus pulls out the loaves and the fishes, and there's so much happening, and he is showing that he is God over top of all of these things, and he is showing who he is, and he's providing, and he's bringing food. But then the next verse happens, and I feel like these verse 14 and 15 are very, very significant, and it's almost like a to be continued. Our hero last week, that's what I feel like. Our hero last week brought us a whole bunch of food out of loaves and fishes. And then this next week, there's an even better episode. But right in the middle is this verse. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, surely this is the prophet who has come into the world. Jesus, knowing that they had intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to the mountain by himself. I feel like this is everything in these 2 verses. I was reading it this week, and I'm like, there's got to be something significant there. So much so that as I was reading, I looked at the NIV, and the NIV, you know how we break up our scriptures into like the feeding of the 5,000, and then it goes into the Jesus walks on water. We have all that. That's obviously not there. No, I shouldn't say obviously. That is not there in the original. That's not how it's all laid out. In the NIV, it puts verse 14 and 15 in the feeding of the 5,000, which is great. That kind of feels like where it's supposed to go. But the NASB, it puts it in the miracle of Jesus walking on water. And I kind of was like struck by that. I'm like, there's something significant here, that it connects the two. So he gets to the end of this one, talking about they want to make him king. And then the next episode comes something that nobody would have expected. And it's him pronouncing he is king, he is Lord over the waters, he is Lord over the sea. It's this amazing, I want to make you king, but he says, no one's going to make me king because I'm already king, and I'm going to show you it to who I want to show it to, how I want to show it to. No one is going to tell me what to do. I am Jesus. So this is what's happening here. I feel like it's quite important. It all kind of reminds me of the temptation of Christ. You know, when the enemy, when Satan has talking to Jesus, he says, I'm going to give you all these lands. I'm going to give you everything. Well, when the people come and say, I'm going to make you king by force, they're saying, you're going to be my king. You can come and bring us everything. There's a temptation there. Jesus can have everything he wants without having to go to the cross. But he stops and he slips away and he gets away. So, that brings us to our story. Jesus walking on water. Now, I read it to the kids, but I'm going to read it again to you. When the evening came, his disciples went down to the lake. When they got into the boat, they set off across for the lake of Capernaum. Now, this lake is about 12 miles around, and it's, I would almost say, you're kind of looking at, no, it's bigger than Wood Lake. That's Wood Lake is right here. Yeah, I think it's bigger than that because it's like 7 miles across the way. And so they have been going, and so they're going across this lake, and they were assuming that Jesus was going to kind of walk around the other side. So, well, he's going to head off there. He's tired. He's had a long day. He did all that cooking for everybody. He's got to have a relaxing time. He needs some time on his phone in the bathroom just to kind of be on his own, and after making all the food for the kids. And so then he's going to walk around by doing a marathon, evidently. So I guess that's what they think. But now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. And a strong wind was blowing, and the seas were churning up, and the waters grew rough. When they had rowed for about 3 or 4 miles, remember, it's 7 miles across, they were struggling at the oars. They were pushing, and they were trying to get through. They were trying to get across. They were doing all they could to get through. And then they saw Jesus approaching on the boat, walking on water. I asked the kids if they've ever tried walking on water. I'm going to ask you guys, how many people here have ever tried walking on water? Think back to when you were a kid now and put your hand up honestly if you've tried walking on water. Okay, there's more of us than that, I promise you. We run into the you know, you ever like get a pool and you just kind of walk. I'm like, how far can I get? Or just like, I even had this moment of faith when I was a kid. I'm like, I got to be able to do this. I'm just going to walk into the beach, onto the water, and just think I can keep going. It didn't work. It did not work, unfortunately. I wonder if when we get to heaven, when we're in our glory in the new heavens and the new earth, if we are just going to be able to do this. Maybe this is the way we were supposed to be made, but we haven't quite figured it out yet. I don't know. That's just me kind of just spitballing here. That's kind of what I do. Anyways, if it is I, and it says, it is I, don't be afraid. This is a very easy thing to imagine from a distance. But it's equally difficult to actually see it happen. In that situation, seeing someone walking to you on water, there is absolutely no reason for this to happen. They have seen the feeding of the 5,000. They've seen what he could do. What's the next episode? What's the to be continued? Nobody would have saw this coming. This is something absolutely different. He says, don't be afraid. Matthew and Mark say that they think they saw a ghost. I'm not going to get a raise of hands who thinks ghosts are real. However, if you saw this at this moment, you would be like, I think ghosts are real. I think there's something to that ghost theory because this is a little bit scary. And then that is, don't be afraid. And when Jesus speaks, there's this moment where you hear him and you're like, I don't need to be afraid anymore. And they invite what they thought was a ghost, into the boat. And immediately, like this young lady saw, they reached the shore where they were heading. It's such a beautiful picture and so many amazing visuals within this story. the disciples rowing and fighting against the sea, and then this ghostly figure walking out onto the water. How does that work? Does his feet go an inch underwater? Is he like levitating over the water? Is he touching the water? Is he getting wet at all? All these questions that you start to have for no good reason, but you have them anyways. And then he comes out and they're like, do you want to come into the boat? How's he getting in the boat? This is amazing. He's in the boat, and then immediately, poof, they're up against the side. This is so amazing, but we need to understand a little bit what's kind of happening here. Jesus is Lord. The thing with the Jewish people, they didn't love the sea. Now, they were fishermen, but they weren't like the Greeks where they were fighting on the sea and they were captain over the sea. They didn't like the sea. This whole chapter reminds us of the Exodus with the bread of life and the manna and then the splitting of the Red Sea. The Jewish people didn't love the sea. They actually had a real adverse relationship with it. As this echoes the story, you know that the Red Sea. It's Revelation 21, verse 1. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. And for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and now there was no longer any sea. The Revelation really echoes the Jewish tradition. And it's really interesting because we're not going to get to heaven, there'll be no water, just a little bit. That's not what's going to happen. But there's this understanding that sea is evil, sea is bad. There's no longer any sea. There's no longer any evil that can come. How many of you, again, big question, how many of you have been out into the middle of the lake when I was a kid? You would get down there, you would get dropped off to go water skiing, the boat kind of goes away, you're on your own, you're looking down, you're like, there's going to be an Ogopogo at this moment, I'm sure of it. The water is a frightening place. The water is so amazing, but it can be frightening. And the sea was something that brought fear. The sea was something that brought this idea of evil coming up out of it. And so in Revelation, they said there's going to be no more sea. Because the sea is where the monsters come from. Now, it sounds funny, but there's a Job says, who alone stretches out the heavens and tramples down the waves of the sea? This idea that the sea is wrong. Daniel 7 is where we start to understand this understanding of monsters in the sea. Daniel said, in my vision at night I looked, and there before me were 4 winds of heaven churning up the great sea. 4 great beasts, each different from the others, came up out of the sea. If you look at the sea and you know that there's 4 great beasts and an Ogopogo coming up out of it, you're going to be worried, you're going to be scared. The sea is not something that people enjoy. And in this idea, it's something to be scared of. So, first of all, Jesus is coming and he's walking over our fears and walking over evil. He is king over evil. That is the first thing that we see in this sign. It's very difficult when you have a sign that's only about 5 or 6 or 7 verses long. You're like, what are they talking about? And if you could suspend that reality for a bit and understand it, we got to talk about what the sea is. And the sea in the Jewish tradition is evil. Not the water itself, but the idea of what comes up out of the sea. It's also political. Because in this same verse, in my vision that night I took, and there before me was one like the Son of Man, coming up from the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days. When he led into the presence, he was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations of people of every language worshipped him. His dominion and everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. See, in these visions, in these 4 beasts that come out of the sea is the political powers of Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. And who has authority over Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome? This name that we know now as the Son of Man comes into this situation here. The Son of Man. Daniel is projecting forward. He is prophesying about the Son of Man coming up out of the sea, having dominion over the politics, having dominion over the rulers of this world. So as Jesus walks on the sea, he has dominion, he has power over Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome, and Canada's politics and America's politics and every other politics we want to get into. It is not those politics we follow, it's the politics of Christ that we follow, and that politic is a politic of love and care. So when Jesus walks on water, he is walking over evil, and he is king over evil, and he is king over politics. And we see that Son of Man coming up out of the water. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee. That is the Sea of Tiberias. I said kind of at the beginning that John doesn't misplace any words. And so at the beginning, John chapter 6, verse 1, sometime after this, Jesus said, he came up from the far shore of the Sea of Galilee. That is the Sea of Tiberias. When we think of the Sea of Galilee, we only think of the Sea of Galilee. That's what we're going to think of now. That's what we're going to think of until the end of our time. It's the Sea of Galilee. We don't think of it as the Sea of Tiberias. But the Sea of Tiberias, who was the Roman emperor from AD 14 to AD 37. This is a little bit boring here, but stick with me. Who is Tiberius? He's the Roman emperor from AD 14, so when Jesus was a teenager, until AD 37. And he came in and he started renaming everything. He built this city. This city here, a new planned city, was going to be the Roman emperor. Was going to be the Roman Empire, and it was going to be around, it was going to have a Roman army in Galilee, and it was going to be mainly populated by Gentiles. So things are changing, and things are starting to change forever. So suddenly, this new Roman emperor comes in, and he puts his stamp on things. Kind of like some of the old classic stadiums, Yankee Stadium. I can't get, okay, I'm from Calgary, so we have the Saddle Dome. I will always call it the Saddle Dome for as long as my hockey team is horrible. It's just something that you call, you're not going to call it whatever else. They have these bowls in America, like the football bowls, and they have one called the Tostito Bowl. I'm like, that's not a very traditional name, I don't think. But you have the Yankee Stadium, and you're always going to call it the Yankee Stadium. But they're going to give it some new capitalist name because they want to give it something else, some extra money in there. This is it's a loose thing that's happening, but what's happening is Tiberius and the Roman Empire is trying to put its stamp on everything. Kind of like when you head around the world and you see the golden arches absolutely everywhere. That McDonald's is trying to put its stamp on absolutely everything. So this sea is the Sea of Tiberias. And so it's not any coincidence that John says at the beginning of John chapter 6 that this is the Sea of Tiberias and Jesus is walking on this because he is Lord over top of everything, even the rulers of his day. So this is what's happening. See, the world that we see right now is the desire to have winners and losers. That's how you differentiate yourself. Are you a winner or are you a loser? Are you doing well in life or are you doing poorly in life? And what Jesus is saying is, I'm going to walk over top of everything. And look, none of us as Christians are winners and losers. Who we are as Christians are we are believers and we are sons and daughters of the King. That's all we need to know that we are. We don't need to be anything special in the world's eyes. We are special in God's eyes. And so we are walking with him. Christians are not winners and losers. We are believers. We don't have to sink or swim. That is the fight of this world. Sink or swim, kill or be killed, eat or be eaten. That is this mantra that we have in our world today. And Jesus is saying, stop, put that aside. Let's just get through this life. And that is what this ultimately we want to look at. Jesus walking on water is personal. It's a personal call to who you are. It's a personal call to who I am. All we're trying to do in this dark and stormy night is get through life. That's all I'm trying to do. There's 7 miles between me and the other side of this life, and I feel like I'm stuck halfway through. I feel like I can't get to the other side. New things come at me. I think I've gotten through one difficult storm and another one rears its head. I feel like I've gotten through one illness in my family and something else comes up and something else takes me down. I feel like I've gotten through one night where I can't sleep, where anxiety gets me, and the next night it comes again. What do we do? How do we get through that? As I was reading it this week, I reminded of this time that my family we're driving from Kenora. Anybody know where Kenora is? A very exciting place. It's on just past the border in Manitoba into Ontario. We're driving from Kenora to Calgary. And we got in the car and we were driving. And it was one of those winter, it's Christmas time we were driving, so it was minus 20, minus 30, blowing snow, black ice. And it was a stressful drive. My parents don't get stressed when they drive, but they were very stressed at this moment. Things were happening. Cars were all in the ditch every which way, and we were just driving. And I thought, how am I going to get through this? It was dark out. We had left, and it was probably, I don't know. I think we left early in the morning, probably 4 in the morning. That's kind of the time we left those long drives. I thought, how are we going to get through this? And all I could think, it was actually quite scary. All I could think is if I fall asleep, if I can get to sleep, then we're going to be at the other side of the drive. You know how you do that when you're a kid, when you're like driving and you want to get to the other side of this drive? You're like, I got 7 hours to go, and if I can sleep from now until there, we're here, we made it. And so I thought, if I can just fall asleep, I'm not going to have to think about the black ice. I'm not going to have to think about the cars in the ditch. I could just be in the car safe. And then if we go off the road, we go off the road. I'll be sleeping anyways, doesn't matter. So I do everything I can just to fall asleep. I fall asleep and bump. We're on the other side, safe, probably in Winnipeg. That's not where I anticipated ending up in, but we're there anyways. That's where the story kind of falls off. But this idea that there is an anxiety provoking and getting into us and hurting us and just bringing this unease in our spirits. And Jesus comes walking on the water the way we least expect it. And when we see and we recognize that that's Jesus, not a ghost, invite him into our boat, bump, we're on the other side. We expect Jesus to do certain things. The people at the feeding of the 5,000 expected Jesus to do what they wanted him to do. They wanted him to be like Disco DJ, the clown puppet, hand puppet, and do what we tell him to do. That's not what Jesus does. Jesus is Lord. There are so many examples throughout the Bible about Jesus bringing calm into a place of fear. I think it's important that we stay in the book of John throughout this, so I'm going to go to the end of the book of John. John chapter 20. After Jesus had risen from the grave, Jesus appears to his disciples. On the evening of that first day in the week, when the disciples were together, the doors locked for the fear of the Jewish leaders. So the disciples were in the upper room, fearful and scared of what was going to happen, what was going to be done to them because of what they had seen and who they had been associated with. And they were fearful of the Jewish leaders. And Jesus came and stood amongst them and said, "Peace be with you." After he said this, he showed them his hands and his side, and the disciples were overjoyed that they saw the Lord. And Jesus said, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you. Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive anyone's sins, their sins are forgiven. If you do not forgive, they are not forgiven." Our lives just always seem to go from one turmoil to the next, one difficult time to the next difficult time, always pushing up, always bumping up against the waves. What we need to do is to stop and let Jesus in. Just after that verse, Jesus goes and he goes into it's that great scene where he's on the lake with the disciples again. And he says to Peter, early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered. He said, "Throw your net into the right side of the boat and you will find some." When they did this, they were unable to haul on the net because of the large number of fish. Then the disciples whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." As soon as Simon Peter heard him said that it is the Lord, he wrapped up his outer garment and jumped into the water. And then they brought him some fish, and they sat and they had breakfast together. This absolutely amazing image of peaceful sitting with Jesus, having breakfast, being in his presence, is what we need. Sometimes when I'm going through difficulties or times, I'm like, how do I do this prayer thing sometimes? What I'll do is just kind of grab a cup of coffee, sit in my living room, maybe make a fire outside, and just sit in God's presence. Just be there with him. Before the storm of the day starts, before everything gets going, not having to recite a certain prayer, just being in God's presence. That's what we need. That's where we are. When we left England, so I was in England for a time, we were there for 4 years. My daughter Emily was born both Selah and Emily were born there, but Emily was due to be born just before we had gotten kicked out, just after we got kicked. So we got kicked out of England. This is big. Sorry, I've just skipped a bunch of stuff. We lived in England. Visas ran out. We got kicked out. But Emily was due to be born right in this spot. It's like third trimester type thing. And we were like, it was tight. And life was confusing and life was difficult. And we didn't know what was going to happen. And we actually looked for a name that meant hope for Emily because we were all out of hope. Because we had only known this family that we had gotten together with in England, this church family. We loved them. And we had nowhere left to come to back in Canada. And the government's saying, it's time for you to leave. Our daughter was due. We had no job to go to. Anxiety set in like you wouldn't believe. We went to the courts. We tried to push back our date. We kept on pushing back our date on the day that we were supposed to be kicked out. Eventually, we did get 2 weeks to leave, but that wasn't until May. Our daughter had been born, spent the first full 4 months of her life loving the life of England. You remember that, Emily? You remember England, don't you, for 4 months. And then eventually we got kicked out. Someone had said to us, a kid, he said, "Jordan, the prayers, your prayers will be answered between the taking off and the landing." Some kind of like lovely idea like that. I'm like, that's interesting. So we get on the plane, looking around. Maybe somebody here will offer me a job. No one did. Sorry. But when we landed, I got an email from a random church in Kamloops saying, "Hey, we want to interview you for a job." It was this amazing little miracle that someone had said, between the taking off and the landing, God's going to provide something. We took off, we landed, there was an email in our inbox saying, "We want to interview you for a job." God took care of that. I tell you right now, from September that we found out we were being kicked out to May, that was the most tumultuous time of our lives up until that point. Absolutely insane. But now it's a footnote. Now it's a bump. Once Jesus came into that situation and we got to the other side, it was just a bump. And I want to encourage you, if you're going through difficult times in your lives right now, one day this may be a bump. This will be a bump, either on this side of eternity or the next. Because we're not winners and losers. We are believers, and we are sons and daughters of the King. Walking through this life, inviting the presence of Jesus into our boat. That doesn't mean things get easy right away, but what it does mean is that his presence can go with us, and then one day, bump on the other side, and we'll be in eternity with Jesus, and saying, "Wow, what a footnote that life was, because now I'm in eternity with you." So we serve a King that is above all. We live with a King that is above all. The feeding of the 5,000 to the walking on the water, that's one and the same story. A story of Jesus being King, how he wants to and when he wants to. I just want to encourage you to let that King into your life. Worship team, if you want to come on up. As we finish, I just want to take some time to read. Oh, there's lots of other stuff I forget about this. Boom, bump, there you go. With every great beginning of a story, there's a great end to a story. And the only story that I really know is Lord of the Rings, and so I always use it. At last, they rode over the downs and took the east road, and then Merry and Pippin rode off to Buckland, and already they were singing again as they went. But Sam turned to buy water, and so came back to the hill, as day was ending once more, and he went on, and there was a yellow light, and a fire within, and the evening meal was ready, and he was expected. And Rose drew him in and set him in his chair and put little Eleanor up on his lap. He drew a deep breath. Well, I'm back, he said. The end of the story. I'm back. We'll be able to sit and relax in the presence of Jesus.